I'm so grateful you've chosen to spend these quiet moments with me as we drift into another captivating tale from history. Tonight, we journey back through the mists of time to meet a man whose simple acts of kindness would ripple across centuries. This is how one person's compassion changed the world forever. The year is 270 in the Common Era, and the Roman Empire stretches its mighty arms across the known world. In the coastal city of Patara, nestled along the Mediterranean shores of what we now call Turkey, the salt air carries whispers of distant lands and foreign gods. Ships from across the empire dock at its bustling harbour, their holds heavy with silk from the east, spices from distant islands, and stories from every corner of civilization. Into this world of marble columns and merchant vessels, a child is born who will transform humanity's understanding of generosity itself. His parents name him Nicholas, meaning victory of the people, though they cannot imagine how prophetic this choice will prove to be. The house where he draws his first breath sits among the white limestone buildings that catch the morning light, like scattered pearls along the harbour. Young Nicholas grows up surrounded by the contradictions of his age. Patara thrives as a centre of trade and learning, yet shadows of persecution loom over the growing Christian community. His parents, wealthy merchants who have embraced the new faith, fill their home with both Roman literature and Christian teachings. The boy learns to read from scrolls of Homer, while his mother whispers stories of Jesus to him in the quiet hours before dawn. The turning point comes when Nicholas is still a young man, barely past his 20th year. A plague sweeps through Patara like a merciless tide, claiming lives with terrifying swiftness. The disease shows no respect for wealth or status, striking down merchants and slaves alike. In a matter of weeks, both of Nicholas's parents succumb to the epidemic, leaving their only son orphaned and heir to a considerable fortune. Standing beside their graves as the Mediterranean wind rustles through the olive trees, Nicholas faces a choice that will echo through eternity. The inheritance before him could secure a life of comfort and privilege. Roman society expects young men of his station to pursue political careers, to build monuments to their own glory, to accumulate power and wealth like so many others before them. But as Nicholas stares out at the harbour, where his father's ships bob gently at anchor, he hears something else calling to him. Perhaps it's the memory of his mother's gentle voice reading from the Christian scriptures, or the echo of Christ's words about selling all possessions to help the poor. Whatever the source, a conviction takes root in his heart that will reshape the world. The young man makes a decision that baffles his peers and horrifies his remaining family. He will give away his inheritance, not just portions of it, not just the excess, but all of it. Every gold coin, every ship, every piece of property will be transformed into relief for those who suffer. The comfortable life that awaits him holds no appeal compared to the joy he discovers in lifting others from desperation. His uncle, a priest in the local Christian community, watches this transformation with wonder and growing respect. The boy he once knew as a curious child has become something extraordinary, a young man whose very presence seems to radiate compassion. Under his uncle's guidance, Nicholas begins formal religious training, preparing for a life devoted not to accumulating wealth, but to serving others. The ordination comes swiftly. Nicholas's devotion, combined with his natural wisdom and the respect he's earned through his charitable works, marks him as exceptional among the clergy. He becomes a priest while still remarkably young, his sermons drawing crowds who come not just to hear his words, but to witness the genuine love that flows through them. But it's what happens next that establishes Nicholas as more than just another generous priest. Word reaches him of a family in desperate circumstances, a situation so dire that it threatens to destroy 3 innocent lives. A man who was once prosperous has lost everything, his wealth dissolved through a combination of poor investments, dishonest partners, and simple misfortune. Such reversals of fortune are common enough in the volatile economy of the Roman world. But this particular case carries devastating consequences. In the society of Nicholas's time, young women require dowries to marry. These payments, made by the bride's family to the grooms, serve as both economic security and social necessity. Without a dowry, a woman faces a future of permanent spinsterhood, economic dependence, and social ostracism. For poor families, the inability to provide dowries often means their daughters must choose between remaining unmarried and destitute, or entering into arrangements that compromise their dignity and safety. This father watches his 3 daughters approach marriageable age with growing horror. Each passing day brings them closer to a fate that keeps him awake through the dark hours. The oldest daughter has already attracted the attention of a suitable young man, but without a dowry, the courtship cannot proceed. Soon, if no solution appears, the family will face an impossible choice between starvation and shame. Nicholas learns of their plight through the whispered conversations that travel through Patara's Christian community. The family's descent into poverty has been swift and merciless, leaving them too proud to beg openly, but too desperate to maintain appearances much longer. They huddle in their increasingly bare home, selling possessions one by one to buy bread, watching hope fade with each passing sunset. What happens next becomes the foundation for one of humanity's most enduring traditions. Nicholas understands that direct charity, however well-intentioned, would humiliate the proud father and make the family objects of public pity. Instead, he devises a plan that preserves their dignity while meeting their desperate need. Under cover of darkness, Nicholas makes his way through Patara's winding streets. The city sleeps peacefully, unaware that history is being written in its shadows. He carries with him a leather purse heavy with gold coins, enough to provide a proper dowry for the eldest daughter. The weight of the gold is nothing compared to the weight of compassion that drives him forward. Reaching the family's modest dwelling, Nicholas finds a window left open to catch the cool night breeze. Without hesitation, he tosses the purse through the opening, where it lands softly in the room where the family sleeps. The deed complete, he vanishes into the darkness as silently as he came, leaving behind only the gift that will transform their desperate circumstances. Morning brings discovery and amazement. The father, rising early from another sleepless night of worry, finds the mysterious purse and can hardly believe what his trembling fingers reveal. Gold coins, genuine and substantial, enough to secure his eldest daughter's future. The family gathers around the unexpected treasure, their voices mixing wonder with gratitude as they struggle to understand this miraculous intervention. The eldest daughter's wedding follows within weeks, a celebration that marks not just the union of 2 young people, but the restoration of a family's hope. Yet even as they rejoice, the father's heart remains heavy with concern for his 2 remaining daughters. The mysterious benefactor has solved one crisis, but 2 more loom ahead. Nicholas, watching from a distance as the wedding procession passes through Patara's streets, feels deep satisfaction at the joy his gift has created. But his work is far from finished. He knows that true compassion requires sustained commitment, not just single acts of kindness. The family's remaining daughters deserve the same chance at happiness and security that their sister has received. The second midnight mission follows months later, when the second daughter reaches marriageable age and a suitable young man begins showing interest. Once again, Nicholas moves through the darkened streets like a guardian angel, carrying another purse of gold. Once again, he finds the window open and delivers his anonymous gift, disappearing before anyone can witness his identity. The pattern of mysterious generosity establishes Nicholas as something unprecedented in his community. Here is wealth being used not to build monuments to ego or secure political influence, but purely to alleviate suffering and create joy. The father, now blessed with 2 married daughters, understands that some divine providence must be at work, though he cannot imagine who serves as its earthly instrument. But curiosity and gratitude drive him to attempt solving the mystery. When the third daughter approaches marriageable age, he positions himself to watch through the long hours of night, determined to identify their benefactor. His vigil stretches across several nights, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, but his heart light with anticipation. Then comes the night that will complete the legend. Nicholas appears once more in the shadows, carrying the third purse of gold that will secure the final daughter's future. But as he approaches the window, he finds it closed against an unusually cool evening. Undeterred by this obstacle, he climbs onto the roof and drops the purse down the chimney, where it tumbles safely into the room below. The sound of the falling purse alerts the watching father, who rushes outside to confront his mysterious benefactor. In the moonlight, he recognizes the young priest, whose reputation for holiness has spread throughout Patara. Falling to his knees in overwhelming gratitude, the father attempts to praise Nicholas publicly for his extraordinary generosity. But Nicholas will have none of it. He helps the man to his feet and speaks words that will echo through centuries. The gifts must remain secret, he insists. True charity seeks no recognition, no public acclaim, no earthly reward. The joy of giving is reward enough, and the preservation of the family's dignity matters more than any praise he might receive. This moment, played out in the quiet streets of an ancient city, establishes principles that will transform human understanding of generosity itself. Nicholas demonstrates that the highest form of giving preserves the recipient's dignity, that anonymous charity prevents the humiliation of obligation, and that true compassion seeks no earthly recognition. The three daughters marry well, their lives transformed from potential tragedy to genuine happiness. But the ripples of Nicholas's actions extend far beyond one family's salvation. Word of the mysterious gifts spreads throughout Patara's Christian community, inspiring others to examine their own capacity for anonymous generosity. The young priest's example begins changing hearts and minds across the city. Yet this is only the beginning of a story that will span centuries and transform civilizations. The man who saved 3 sisters from desperation is about to face trials that will test his own faith and establish him as one of history's most remarkable figures. The world he's helping to shape will soon demand everything he has to give. The Roman Empire in Nicholas's time was a vast machine of conquest and control, but it was also a world where ideas could travel as swiftly as merchant ships across the Mediterranean. The young priest's reputation began to spread beyond the boundaries of Patara, carried by traders who witnessed his works and pilgrims who sought his counsel. Stories of the mysterious gift-giver reached distant ports, each telling embellished with new details, each listener adding their own wonder to the growing legend. But Nicholas's world was about to change dramatically. The year 303 brought with it the Great Persecution, the most systematic and brutal campaign against Christians in the empire's history. Emperor Diocletian, convinced that the growing Christian faith threatened Roman traditions and imperial authority, issued a series of edicts that transformed believers from tolerated citizens into hunted enemies of the state. The persecution began with symbolic attacks on Christian worship. Churches were ordered destroyed, their sacred books burned in public squares, their precious vessels melted down for imperial coffers. Christian clergy were stripped of legal protections and civil rights. What started as legal harassment quickly escalated into violence that would test the faith of an entire generation. Nicholas, now recognized as one of Patara's most influential Christian leaders, found himself a prime target. Roman officials understood that breaking the spirit of local religious leaders would demoralize entire communities. They came for him on a night when winter winds howled off the Mediterranean, their torches casting dancing shadows on the walls of the modest quarters where he lived in voluntary poverty. The arrest was swift and brutal. Soldiers trained in intimidation dragged the young priest from his prayers, binding his hands with ropes that cut into his wrists. They marched him through streets where citizens who had benefited from his generosity watched in horrified silence, afraid to speak, lest they too be marked for persecution. The man who had moved through these same streets as an angel of mercy now walked them as a prisoner facing an uncertain fate. The prison, where they confined Nicholas, was a testament to Roman efficiency in breaking human spirits. Carved from solid rock beneath the city's administrative buildings, its cells received no natural light and little fresh air. The dampness seeped into prisoners' bones, while the constant darkness disoriented minds accustomed to the rhythms of day and night. Here, Christians who refused to renounce their faith were subjected to methodical torture designed to extract either compliance or confession. Nicholas endured months of systematic brutality. His captors employed techniques perfected through centuries of imperial interrogation, alternating physical torment with psychological pressure. They broke his nose during one particularly violent session, an injury that would mark his face for the remainder of his life. Yet through beatings that left him barely conscious and deprivation that weakened his body, he maintained the same gentle demeanor that had characterized his ministry. Fellow prisoners later testified to the extraordinary way Nicholas conducted himself during those dark months. Rather than succumb to despair or rage, he used his suffering as an opportunity to strengthen others. In whispered conversations during brief moments when guards were absent, he offered comfort to broken men and women who had lost hope. His own pain became a source of healing for those who shared his captivity. The torture sessions revealed something remarkable about the man who had given away his inheritance to help others. When Roman interrogators demanded he renounce Christ and make offerings to imperial gods, Nicholas responded with the same quiet determination that had driven his midnight missions of mercy. No threat could shake his commitment to the faith that had transformed his understanding of human purpose. But perhaps most extraordinary was how Nicholas treated his torturers. Guards accustomed to prisoners who cursed them or begged for mercy found themselves unsettled by this priest who spoke to them with genuine compassion. Even in his chains, bruised and bleeding, he inquired about their families and offered prayers for their well-being. Some later claimed that his presence in the prison had a calming effect that extended far beyond his immediate cell. The persecution that seemed destined to destroy the Christian faith instead demonstrated its transformative power. Stories of Nicholas's courage spread through underground networks that connected believers across the empire. His refusal to compromise his principles, even under the most extreme duress, inspired countless others to maintain their own faith despite the dangers. The young man who had saved 3 sisters from desperation was now saving souls from despair. Then, like dawn breaking after an endless night, everything changed. Emperor Constantine's victory at the Battle of Milvian Bridge in 312 marked not just a military triumph, but a spiritual revolution. The new emperor, claiming divine inspiration from the Christian God, began dismantling the apparatus of persecution that had terrorized believers for nearly a decade. Prison doors opened, releasing survivors who emerged blinking into sunlight they had feared they might never see again. Nicholas walked free, bearing physical scars that would remind him forever of his suffering, but his spirit remained unbroken. The broken nose and other injuries marked his body, yet his return to Patara was greeted with celebrations that echoed across the Christian community. Here was living proof that faith could survive the empire's worst efforts to destroy it. His survival seemed miraculous to those who had despaired during his long imprisonment. The world Nicholas returned to had been fundamentally altered by the years of persecution. Many Christians had fled to remote regions, creating new communities far from imperial oversight. Others had endured by practicing their faith in secret, developing networks of communication and support that would prove invaluable in the coming decades. The church that emerged from this trial was stronger, more unified, and more determined to spread its message across the known world. But Constantine's conversion brought new challenges alongside new freedoms. The emperor who had ended persecution now sought to use Christianity as a unifying force for his diverse empire. This political embrace of the faith created opportunities for growth, but also dangers of compromise and corruption. Church leaders found themselves navigating between spiritual principles and imperial expectations, between pastoral care and political influence. It was in this complex environment that Nicholas received an invitation that would place him at the center of one of Christianity's most important theological debates. The year 325 brought a summons to attend the Council of Nicaea, the first ecumenical council in Christian history. Bishops from across the empire were called to address a theological controversy that threatened to split the faith just as it was gaining imperial acceptance. The Arian controversy, named for a priest from Alexandria who taught that Christ was subordinate to God the Father, had divided Christian communities across the empire. Arius argued that Jesus was the first and greatest of God's creations, but not truly divine in the same sense as the Father. This teaching, which seemed to diminish Christ's status, had gained significant support among educated Christians who found it more philosophically coherent than traditional teachings about divine equality. Nicholas's journey to Nicaea took him through landscapes scarred by recent persecution, but now buzzing with renewed Christian activity. New churches were rising from the ruins of destroyed sanctuaries. Believers who had worshipped in secret were emerging to practice their faith openly. Yet beneath this revival lay serious theological divisions that could prove as destructive as any imperial persecution. The council convened in a magnificent hall provided by Constantine himself, its marble columns and gilded ceiling reflecting the emperor's commitment to Christian unity. Bishops from regions as diverse as Britain and Persia gathered to debate questions that would shape Christian doctrine for centuries to come. The sight of these church leaders, many bearing scars from recent persecution, assembling freely under imperial protection, seemed almost miraculous to those who remembered darker times. Nicholas took his place among these theological giants as a relatively young bishop whose reputation rested more on pastoral care than scholarly achievement. Yet his experience of suffering had given him insights that purely academic theologians sometimes lacked. He understood that theological questions were not mere intellectual exercises, but matters that affected how ordinary believers understood their relationship with God. The debates were intense and sometimes heated. Arians presented sophisticated arguments that appealed to Greek philosophical traditions, emphasizing divine hierarchy and order. Their opponents countered with scriptural evidence and theological reasoning that supported the traditional view of Christ's full divinity. The discussion stretched across weeks, with each side marshalling evidence and developing increasingly complex arguments. It was during these theological battles that Nicholas's character was most fully revealed. While other bishops impressed audiences with rhetorical flourishes and philosophical sophistication, Nicholas spoke with the simple clarity of someone whose faith had been tested by suffering. His words carried the weight of experience rather than mere learning. When he addressed the assembly, delegates listened not just to his arguments, but to the authentic voice of someone who had paid a price for his beliefs. The council's ultimate decision to affirm Christ's full divinity, expressed in the Nicene Creed that Christians still recite today, reflected the kind of theological clarity that Nicholas had long embodied. His support for this position was unwavering, rooted in his understanding that the faith that had sustained him through persecution required a Christ who was truly God, not merely God's greatest creation. The man who had learned compassion from following Jesus needed that Jesus to be divine enough to make such transformation possible. But Nicholas's impact at Nicaea extended beyond theological debate. His presence reminded other bishops of the pastoral dimensions of their theological decisions. While scholars argued about philosophical implications, Nicholas kept attention focused on how these teachings would affect ordinary believers. His questions often redirected abstract discussions toward practical considerations of Christian life and ministry. The council also revealed Nicholas's capacity for righteous anger when confronted with what he saw as attacks on fundamental Christian truth. Later legends would claim that he actually struck the Arian leader during one heated exchange, though historical evidence for such dramatic confrontation remains unclear. What seems certain is that Nicholas's passion for orthodox teaching was as intense as his commitment to charitable service. The man who had shown infinite patience with suffering prisoners had little tolerance for theological positions that he believed undermined the faith. When the council concluded and bishops began their journeys home, Nicholas carried with him a renewed sense of purpose. The theological victory at Nicaea had preserved essential Christian teachings, but the work of building up the church in this new era of imperial favour was just beginning. The priest who had given away his inheritance to help three sisters would now help build an institution that would transform human civilization. The world Nicholas was helping to shape would soon extend far beyond the boundaries of the Roman Empire. Christian missionaries, emboldened by imperial acceptance and theological clarity, were already carrying the faith to distant lands. The principles of anonymous generosity and sacrificial love that he embodied would travel with them, taking root in cultures that had never heard of Patara or its remarkable bishop. Yet even as Nicholas's influence spread, he remained fundamentally the same man who had chosen compassion over comfort in his youth. His episcopal palace, when he finally accepted one, remained open to any who needed help. His personal quarters stayed simple, reflecting a lifestyle that valued service over luxury. The bishop who could have lived like a prince continued to live like a servant, finding his greatest joy in meeting human needs rather than accumulating human praise. The decades following the Council of Nicaea brought profound changes to the world Nicholas inhabited. The Roman Empire, now officially Christian, began transforming its laws and customs to reflect the teachings that had once been persecuted. Yet with this transformation came new challenges that would test the bishop's wisdom in ways his earlier trials had not prepared him for. In Myra, where Nicholas had been appointed bishop, the responsibilities of his office extended far beyond the spiritual welfare of his flock. As Christianity gained imperial favour, bishops found themselves serving as civic leaders, judges in legal disputes, and administrators of charitable institutions that grew more complex with each passing year. The simple priest who had once given away gold coins through windows now oversaw vast networks of aid that reached across entire provinces. The transformation of Christian charity from individual acts of kindness to institutional systems of relief represented a revolution in human social organization. Under Nicholas's guidance, the church in Myra established hostels for travelers, hospitals for the sick, and distribution centers for food during times of scarcity. What had begun as one man's response to a family's desperate need was evolving into a comprehensive approach to addressing human suffering on a massive scale. Yet Nicholas never lost sight of the personal dimension that had always characterized his ministry. Stories spread throughout the region of the bishop, who still walked among his people, seeking out those whose needs might be overlooked by larger charitable systems. He understood that institutional efficiency, however necessary, could never replace the individual attention that human dignity required. The maritime culture of Myra brought Nicholas into contact with travelers from every corner of the known world. Sailors carried stories of his compassion to distant ports, while merchants spread accounts of his wisdom to inland trading centers. The bishop's reputation began to transcend the boundaries of Christianity itself, attracting respect from followers of other faiths who recognized in him a universal commitment to human welfare. One particular incident that occurred during these years would become legendary among seafaring communities for centuries to come. A violent storm had trapped a group of merchant vessels in Myra's harbour, their crews growing increasingly anxious as provisions dwindled and the weather showed no signs of improving. The trapped sailors, representing a dozen different nationalities and religious traditions, faced the prospect of starvation if the storm continued much longer. Nicholas arrived at the harbour as dawn broke over waters still churned by fierce winds. The sight that greeted him was one of desperation barely held in check by maritime discipline. Seasoned sailors who had weathered countless storms huddled on their vessels, their faces etched with worry as they calculated how much longer their supplies would last. The local population, already stretched by recent crop failures, could offer little assistance without endangering their own survival. What followed demonstrated the bishop's genius for transforming despair into hope through practical compassion. Nicholas organized a systematic response that drew upon every resource available in the city. Wealthy merchants were encouraged to open their private stores, while common citizens contributed whatever they could spare. More importantly, he established a distribution system that ensured aid reached those most in need, while preserving the dignity of those who received it. But Nicholas's intervention went beyond mere logistics. He spent hours moving among the stranded sailors, listening to their concerns, and offering comfort that transcended religious differences. His presence seemed to calm fears that threatened to erupt into panic, while his quiet confidence reassured experienced mariners that they would survive this trial. When the storm finally broke and the ships could sail, many crews carried with them stories of the Christian bishop whose compassion had saved their lives. The incident at the harbour established Nicholas as a protector of seafarers, a reputation that would spread along trading routes stretching from Britain to India. Sailors began invoking his name when storms threatened, while port cities erected shrines in his honour. The priest who had once helped 3 sisters now found himself patron to countless thousands who made their living on dangerous seas. These maritime connections would prove crucial in spreading both Nicholas's reputation and the charitable principles he embodied. Every ship that left Myra carried stories of the bishop's generosity to distant ports, while returning vessels brought news of how his example was inspiring similar acts of compassion in far-off lands. The network of goodwill that emerged from these exchanges created bonds between communities separated by vast distances but united by shared values of mutual aid and human dignity. As Nicholas's fame spread, pilgrims began arriving in Myra to seek his counsel and witness his ministry firsthand. These visitors came from every level of society, from wealthy aristocrats seeking spiritual guidance to desperate peasants hoping for miraculous intervention. The bishop received them all with the same gentle attention, treating emperors and beggars as equals in their fundamental need for compassion and understanding. The steady stream of pilgrims transformed Myra from a provincial port into a significant centre of Christian culture. Monasteries and hospices arose to accommodate the growing number of visitors, while scholars arrived to study the theological insights that emerged from Nicholas's practical application of Christian principles. The city became a laboratory for exploring how faith could address the concrete challenges of human existence. Yet success brought its own temptations and dangers. Wealthy donors sought to honour Nicholas with magnificent buildings and costly gifts, offerings that could have provided him with luxury beyond anything his wealthy parents had enjoyed. The bishop consistently refused such honours, redirecting resources intended for his comfort toward meeting the needs of others. His personal quarters remained simple, his clothing modest, his diet basic, even as the institutions he supervised grew increasingly elaborate. This contrast between personal simplicity and institutional grandeur reflected Nicholas's deep understanding of leadership principles that would influence Christian thought for centuries. He demonstrated that true authority came not from external symbols of power, but from authentic service to those under one's care. The bishop, who could have lived like a prince, chose instead to live like a servant, finding his greatest satisfaction in enabling others to flourish. The theological implications of Nicholas's approach to charity were as revolutionary as its practical effects. Traditional Roman concepts of beneficence had emphasized the honor that generous giving brought to the donor, often requiring public recognition and elaborate ceremonies to celebrate philanthropic acts. Nicholas's insistence on anonymous giving challenged these assumptions, suggesting that the highest form of generosity sought no earthly reward. This principle of selfless giving began influencing Christian communities throughout the empire. Wealthy believers started establishing charitable foundations that operated without identifying their benefactors, while ordinary Christians found new ways to help their neighbors without seeking recognition for their kindness. The culture of competitive philanthropy that had characterized Roman society gave way to a new ethic of humble service. The transformation extended beyond individual behavior to reshape social institutions themselves. Legal systems began incorporating principles of mercy and restoration, alongside traditional concepts of punishment and retribution. Economic structures evolved to include provisions for those unable to participate fully in market activities. Political arrangements started acknowledging obligations to protect the vulnerable, rather than simply serving the powerful. These changes did not occur without resistance from those who benefited from traditional arrangements. Conservative elements within both Roman society and the Christian community sometimes viewed Nicholas's innovations with suspicion, arguing that excessive concern for the poor encouraged laziness and undermined social order. The bishop faced criticism from those who believed charity should be limited to the deserving poor, or distributed only through established hierarchies. Nicholas responded to such criticism not with argument, but with results. The communities that embraced his charitable principles consistently demonstrated greater stability, prosperity, and social harmony than those that clung to older patterns of exploitation and neglect. Cities that established comprehensive systems of aid found themselves better able to weather economic disruptions, while regions that ignored the needs of their most vulnerable members often faced social unrest and economic decline. The practical success of Nicholas's approach gradually won over even skeptical observers. Merchants discovered that communities with strong charitable networks provided more reliable trading partners, while administrators found that attention to social welfare reduced the costs of maintaining public order. What had begun as religious idealism proved to have profound practical benefits that extended far beyond the Christian community itself. As the years passed, and Nicholas entered the final phase of his remarkable life, his influence continued expanding in ways that would have seemed impossible when he first gave away his inheritance to help 3 desperate sisters. The principles he had embodied were taking root in cultures across the known world, carried by traders, pilgrims, and missionaries who had witnessed their transformative power firsthand. The old bishop, now bearing the physical marks of his long service, could look back on a lifetime that had fundamentally altered human understanding of generosity, compassion, and social responsibility. Yet he remained focused not on past achievements but on present needs, continuing to serve his community with the same dedication that had characterized his earliest ministry. His legacy was already beginning to take on a life of its own, spreading beyond the boundaries of any single religion or culture to become part of humanity's shared heritage of wisdom about how to create more compassionate societies. The man who had chosen love over luxury was teaching the world that true wealth lay not in what one accumulated, but in what one gave away. The evening light, filtering through the windows of his simple quarters, cast gentle shadows on the worn face of someone whose life had become a testament to the power of selfless service. Nicholas could not have imagined how far his example would travel, or how many lives it would touch. But he could see clearly the immediate effects of his choices in the transformed community that surrounded him. If you enjoy, the winter of 343 arrived with unusual severity across the Mediterranean world. In Myra, the harbour that had witnessed so many of Nicholas's interventions lay partially frozen, an almost unheard of occurrence that seemed to mirror the approaching end of an extraordinary era. The bishop, now in his 70s, moved more slowly through the streets where he had once walked with youthful vigour. Yet his presence still carried the same transformative power that had marked his entire ministry. Word of Nicholas's failing health spread through the networks of communication that his charitable work had helped establish. Pilgrims who had planned visits to Myra quickened their pace, understanding that time was running short to meet the man whose reputation had drawn them from distant lands. Sailors adjusted their routes to pay respects to the bishop, who had become their patron and protector. Even those who had never met him personally felt compelled to honor someone whose influence had touched their lives in countless indirect ways. The approaching transition created a sense of urgency among those who understood the magnitude of what was ending. Nicholas had become more than just a local bishop, or even a regional saint. He represented a new way of understanding human responsibility toward others, a living demonstration that individual choices could create ripples of change, extending far beyond their immediate circumstances. In his final months, Nicholas continued the practices that had defined his ministry. Despite physical weakness that required assistance for even simple tasks, he insisted on maintaining his schedule of visits to the sick and his availability to anyone seeking counsel. Those who helped him during these last days later testified to witnessing something remarkable in how he approached his own mortality with the same selfless concern for others that had characterized his entire adult life. The bishop's final teachings took on special significance as his community recognized they were receiving his last direct guidance. Rather than focusing on theological abstractions or institutional concerns, Nicholas returned repeatedly to the simple principles that had guided his ministry. Love expressed through practical action remained more important than elaborate ceremony. Anonymous generosity preserved human dignity better than public charity. The needs of the most vulnerable should take precedence over the comfort of the privileged. Perhaps most importantly, Nicholas emphasized that the work he had begun could not end with his death. The transformation of human society toward greater compassion required not just individual saints, but entire communities committed to serving others. Each person who had been touched by his ministry carried responsibility for continuing the ripple effects of kindness that could eventually reshape the world. When death finally came on December 6th, 343, it arrived quietly in the bishop's simple quarters as winter dawn broke over the Mediterranean. Those keeping vigil reported that Nicholas's final words were prayers not for his own soul, but for the welfare of those he was leaving behind. His passing seemed less like an ending than a transition, as if his influence was simply moving from physical presence to spiritual legacy. The immediate response to Nicholas's death revealed how profoundly he had affected his world. Myra's harbour filled with ships as news spread along trading routes. Pilgrims who had travelled great distances to meet him chose to remain for the funeral, understanding they were witnessing the end of an era. Local residents who had known him personally mingled with strangers who had come simply because his reputation had reached their distant communities. But the most remarkable aspect of the response was how it transcended religious boundaries. While Christian communities throughout the empire mourned their beloved bishop, followers of other faiths also paid respects to someone whose universal compassion had earned their admiration. Jewish merchants who had benefited from his fairness, pagan sailors who had been saved by his intervention, and philosophers who had been impressed by his wisdom, all joined in honouring his memory. The funeral itself embodied the principles Nicholas had lived by. Rather than elaborate ceremony focused on honouring the deceased, the service emphasized continuing his work of caring for others. Food was distributed to the hungry, shelter was provided for travellers, and resources were shared with anyone in need. The community celebrated Nicholas's life by demonstrating the values he had taught them. Yet even as Myra mourned, the broader implications of Nicholas's death were becoming apparent. The man who had insisted on anonymous charity was about to become one of history's most famous figures. The bishop who had avoided public recognition would soon be honoured, with thousands of churches bearing his name. The simple priest who had given away gold coins through windows was destined to inspire traditions that would touch billions of lives. The transformation began almost immediately. Pilgrims carried stories of Nicholas's miracles and teachings back to their home communities, where local leaders adapted his methods to their own circumstances. Merchants incorporated his principles of fair dealing into their business practices. Sailors invoked his protection during dangerous voyages while pledging to help others as he had helped them. Within decades, Nicholas's influence had spread throughout the Christian world and beyond. Churches dedicated to his memory arose in major cities across the Roman Empire, each becoming a center for charitable work modeled on his example. Monasteries adopted his emphasis on practical service alongside spiritual devotion. Even secular institutions began incorporating principles of compassionate governance that reflected his teachings. The stories of Nicholas's life took on new dimensions as they traveled across cultures and centuries. Each community that embraced his example added details that reflected their own understanding of how compassion should be expressed. The basic narrative of the mysterious gift-giver remained constant, but its applications expanded to address every form of human need and suffering. Maritime communities developed particularly rich traditions around Nicholas's memory. Sailors facing storms would pray for his intervention, often reporting miraculous rescues that they attributed to his continuing protection. Coastal cities erected shrines where departing voyagers could seek blessing and returning crews could offer thanksgiving. The bishop who had helped stranded sailors in Myra's harbour became patron to everyone whose livelihood depended on the dangerous seas. But perhaps most significantly, Nicholas's emphasis on protecting children began inspiring new social institutions dedicated to their welfare. Communities that had previously accepted child abandonment and exploitation started establishing orphanages, schools, and protective services. The priest who had understood that society's treatment of its most vulnerable members reflected its moral character became the inspiration for systematic efforts to shield children from harm. The evolution of gift-giving traditions connected to Nicholas's memory demonstrated how powerful symbols could carry moral teachings across cultural boundaries. The practice of leaving anonymous gifts, originally inspired by his midnight missions of mercy, spread throughout Europe and eventually across the world. Each culture adapted the tradition to its own customs, yet the underlying message remained consistent. True generosity sought no recognition and preserved the dignity of those who received help. And as centuries passed, the figure of St. Nicholas continued evolving while maintaining his essential character as champion of the vulnerable and model of selfless service. Medieval Europeans developed elaborate festivals celebrating his feast day, complete with dramatic reenactments of his most famous miracles. These celebrations served not merely as entertainment, but as community-wide affirmations of values that Nicholas had embodied. The Protestant Reformation, despite its criticism of Saint Veneration, could not diminish Nicholas's appeal among ordinary believers, who found in his story a perfect example of faith expressed through works. Even communities that rejected formal sainthood continued honoring his memory through charitable traditions and gift-giving customs that preserved his essential message about the transformative power of anonymous generosity. The colonial expansion of European powers carried Nicholas's influence to every continent, where his story adapted to local conditions while maintaining its universal themes. Native American communities incorporated him into their own traditions of seasonal giving. African cultures connected his protection of children to their ancestral values of community responsibility. Asian societies found parallels between his teachings and their own philosophical emphasis on compassionate action. The Industrial Revolution created new forms of human suffering that demanded innovative applications of Nicholas's principles. Factory workers facing exploitation found hope in traditions that promised divine protection for the vulnerable. Urban poor struggling with anonymity in growing cities discovered community through celebrations that emphasized mutual care and support. The ancient bishop's example proved remarkably adaptable to modern challenges. The emergence of secular gift-giving traditions in the 19th and 20th centuries represented perhaps the most remarkable testament to Nicholas's enduring influence. Even as Santa Claus evolved into a largely commercial figure, the underlying impulse toward anonymous generosity continued shaping human behavior. Children who had never heard of St. Nicholas still experienced the joy of unexpected gifts that preserved his original message about the mystery and power of selfless love. Modern psychological research has confirmed what Nicholas seemed to understand intuitively about the nature of effective charity. Anonymous giving does indeed preserve recipient dignity more effectively than public philanthropy. Communities that prioritize care for their most vulnerable members do demonstrate greater social stability and cohesion. The principles that guided a 4th century bishop continue proving their practical value in addressing contemporary challenges. The globalization of communication has created new opportunities for the kind of networks that Nicholas helped establish through his maritime connections. International relief organizations operate according to principles of anonymous aid and universal human dignity that directly reflect his teachings. Modern supply chains that deliver emergency assistance to disaster areas function much like the trading routes that once carried stories of his compassion to distant ports. Contemporary environmental challenges have sparked renewed interest in Nicholas's understanding of stewardship and community responsibility. Climate activists find inspiration in his example of personal sacrifice for the common good. Sustainable development programs incorporate his emphasis on meeting immediate needs while building long-term community resilience. The bishop who understood that individual choices could create far-reaching consequences speaks powerfully to a generation grappling with global interconnection. The digital age has created new forms of anonymous giving that would have delighted Nicholas. Online platforms allow modern benefactors to help strangers while preserving the mystery that made his original gift so powerful. Social media networks spread stories of unexpected kindness that echo his midnight missions of mercy. The same human impulses that drove him to help 3 desperate sisters now motivate countless acts of virtual generosity that span continents and cultures. Educational institutions worldwide continue drawing inspiration from Nicholas's combination of intellectual rigor and practical compassion. Schools bearing his name emphasize not just academic achievement, but also character development and service to others. Universities studying his historical impact recognize how individual examples of moral courage can influence entire civilizations. The bishop, who attended the Council of Nicaea while maintaining his commitment to pastoral care, remains a model for integrating scholarly pursuit with human service. Medical professionals find particular relevance in Nicholas's approach to healing that addressed both physical and spiritual needs. Hospitals named in his honor maintain his tradition of treating all patients with equal dignity, regardless of their ability to pay. Medical mission organizations follow his example of bringing aid to the most remote and underserved communities. The priest who comforted fellow prisoners during persecution continues inspiring those who dedicate their lives to alleviating human suffering. The continuing evolution of charitable institutions reflects Nicholas's understanding that effective compassion requires both individual commitment and systematic organization. Modern nonprofits operate according to principles of transparency and efficiency that honor his emphasis on directing resources towards those most in need. International aid agencies coordinate relief efforts across national boundaries, much like the networks of mutual support that emerge from his maritime ministry. Even commercial enterprises have recognized the practical benefits of incorporating Nicolaitans principles into their operations. Companies that prioritize employee welfare and community responsibility often demonstrate greater long-term sustainability than those focused solely on profit maximization. Business leaders who understand their role as stewards rather than mere accumulators of wealth follow patterns established by the young man who gave away his inheritance to help others. The artistic legacy inspired by Nicholas's story spans every medium and cultural tradition, from ancient icons to contemporary films. Each generation of artists has found new ways to express the timeless appeal of his example. Musicians compose songs celebrating anonymous generosity. Painters create images of mysterious gift-givers helping desperate families. Writers craft stories that update his adventures for modern audiences while preserving their essential moral teachings. The psychological impact of Nicholas's story on individual development cannot be overstated. Children who grow up with traditions inspired by his memory often demonstrate greater empathy and prosocial behavior than those without such cultural influences. The expectation of mysterious gifts encourages young minds to believe in the possibility of unexpected help during difficult times. Adults who remember childhood experiences of anonymous kindness often become more generous themselves, perpetuating cycles of compassion that span generations. Religious scholars studying Nicholas's enduring appeal have identified patterns that illuminate fundamental aspects of human nature and social organization. His story resonates across cultures because it addresses universal experiences of vulnerability, hope, and the transformative power of unexpected kindness. Research into charitable behavior consistently demonstrates that anonymous giving produces more positive psychological outcomes for both donors and recipients than public philanthropy, validating principles that Nicholas embodied centuries before modern psychology existed. The theological significance of Nicholas's legacy extends far beyond his role in establishing gift-giving traditions. His integration of mystical spirituality with practical service created a model for religious life that influenced monastic movements throughout medieval Europe. Contemplative communities found in his example a way to balance interior spiritual development with active engagement in addressing worldly suffering. The bishop who prayed through the night and served through the day showed that authentic spirituality enhanced rather than escaped from human responsibility. Contemporary liberation theologians have rediscovered Nicholas's revolutionary understanding of wealth and power. His decision to liquidate his inheritance rather than use it to gain political influence represents a radical critique of systems that concentrate resources among elites while masses struggle for basic necessities. Modern movements for economic justice find inspiration in his demonstration that privileged individuals can choose solidarity with the oppressed rather than complicity with oppressive structures. The diplomatic implications of Nicholas's ministry deserve special attention in our interconnected world. His ability to navigate relationships between competing religious and political authorities while maintaining his core principles offers lessons for modern international relations. The bishop who survived imperial persecution while building bridges across cultural divides demonstrated that principled engagement could achieve more than either confrontation or accommodation alone. Anthropologists studying gift economies have found in Nicholas's practices a sophisticated understanding of how material exchanges create and maintain social bonds. His insistence on preserving recipient dignity through anonymous giving recognized that charity could either strengthen or undermine community cohesion, depending on how it was administered. Contemporary development programs increasingly incorporate similar insights about the importance of maintaining local agency and avoiding dependency relationships. The environmental movement has discovered unexpected relevance in Nicholas's teachings about stewardship and community responsibility. His emphasis on using personal resources to address immediate human needs while building sustainable support systems resonates with modern efforts to balance economic development with ecological preservation. Climate activists find inspiration in his willingness to make personal sacrifices for the common good, demonstrating that individual choices can indeed create far-reaching positive change. Psychological research into resilience and post-traumatic growth has illuminated aspects of Nicholas's response to persecution that extend far beyond religious contexts. His ability to maintain compassionate engagement with others, despite experiencing severe trauma, demonstrates patterns that modern therapists recognize as indicators of exceptional emotional intelligence and spiritual maturity. Survivors of various forms of oppression find hope in his example of transforming personal suffering into sources of strength for serving others. The evolution of Santa Claus from St. Nicholas represents one of history's most fascinating examples of cultural transmission and adaptation. Each society that embraced his story modified details to reflect local values and customs, while preserving essential themes about the mystery and power of anonymous generosity. This process demonstrates how powerful archetypal figures can transcend their original contexts to become universal symbols that unite diverse communities around shared human experiences. Modern neuroscience has begun explaining the physiological mechanisms underlying the psychological benefits of generous behavior that Nicholas seemed to understand intuitively. Brain imaging studies reveal that acts of selfless giving activate reward centers more powerfully than receiving benefits, validating his insight that true happiness came from serving others rather than accumulating personal advantages. The biochemical basis for what researchers now call the helper's high provides scientific foundation for spiritual teachings that he embodied. Digital technology has created unprecedented opportunities for the kind of anonymous charitable networks that Nicholas pioneered through maritime trading connections. Crowdfunding platforms allow modern benefactors to help strangers across the globe while maintaining the mystery that made his original gifts so powerful. Cryptocurrency systems enable completely untraceable donations that preserve recipient privacy in ways he would have appreciated. The continuing relevance of Nicholas's approach to child protection has become especially apparent in our era of increased awareness about childhood vulnerability and trauma. His understanding that society's treatment of its most defenseless members reflected its moral character anticipated modern human rights frameworks by more than a millennium. Contemporary child advocacy organizations operate according to principles of dignity and protection that directly reflect his teachings. International humanitarian law has incorporated concepts of universal human dignity and responsibility to protect the vulnerable that trace their intellectual lineage to Nicholas's ministry. The principle that national sovereignty cannot excuse indifference to massive human suffering echoes his conviction that proximity and capability created moral obligations that transcended political boundaries. Modern interventions to prevent genocide and protect refugees follow ethical frameworks that he helped establish. The study of organizational leadership has identified in Nicholas's administrative style principles that remain remarkably relevant for contemporary management challenges. His combination of personal simplicity with institutional effectiveness, his emphasis on servant leadership over hierarchical authority, and his ability to inspire voluntary cooperation rather than demand compliance through coercion offer models for leaders in every sector of modern society. Educational philosophy continues drawing insights from Nicholas's integration of intellectual development with character formation. Schools worldwide that bear his name typically emphasize not just academic achievement, but also moral reasoning and practical service to others. His example demonstrates how genuine learning transforms not just individual understanding, but also social engagement, creating ripple effects that extend far beyond classroom walls. The medical profession finds enduring relevance in Nicholas's holistic approach to healing that addressed psychological and spiritual dimensions alongside physical ailments. Healthcare institutions named in his honor often pioneer innovative approaches to patient care that recognize the interconnection between emotional support and clinical treatment. His understanding that authentic healing required attention to the whole person rather than just symptoms continues influencing medical education and practice. Urban planning specialists have begun recognizing how Nicholas's emphasis on community networks and mutual support offers alternatives to modern patterns of social isolation and individualistic development. Cities that prioritize public spaces for gathering and celebration, that design infrastructure to facilitate rather than hinder human connection, and that integrate charitable institutions into neighborhood fabric often demonstrate greater social cohesion and resilience than those organized purely around economic efficiency. The rise of corporate social responsibility reflects growing business recognition that sustainable success requires attention to community welfare rather than just shareholder profits. Companies that adopt stakeholder models of governance follow patterns that Nicholas established when he used his family's commercial resources to address broader social needs. Modern executives who understand their role as stewards, rather than mere wealth accumulators, continue his tradition of using privilege to serve others. And so we reach the end of our journey with St. Nicholas, a man whose simple acts of kindness rippled across centuries to transform the very fabric of human compassion. From a grieving young man giving away his inheritance to help 3 desperate sisters, to a global symbol of anonymous generosity touching billions of lives, his story reminds us that individual choices can indeed change the world forever. The bishop who dropped gold through windows in ancient Patara continues inspiring acts of selfless love in our modern age, proving that true wealth lies not in what we accumulate, but in what we give away. His legacy lives on every time someone helps a stranger, every time kindness is offered without expectation of recognition, every time we choose love over luxury, transforming not just individual lives, but the very fabric of human culture itself. If these gentle explorations into history help you unwind at the end of your day, I'd be honored if you take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Your support means the world to me, and it helps other weary souls discover these peaceful tales. And please, share your thoughts in the comments below. Which aspects of St. Nicholas's story resonate most deeply with you?